Before I tell you this story, I need you to understand one thing about me. I have never raised my voice in an argument. I have never made a scene. I have never threatened anyone in my life. I'm a 69-year-old retired school teacher who grows tomatoes in her backyard and reads by the window every evening. And that is exactly why, when my daughter-in-law handed me a 30-day eviction notice in my own kitchen, she was not even slightly afraid of me. She thought I was harmless. She thought I would cry, maybe beg, maybe quietly comply. She had spent 2 years in my home and she still had no idea who I actually was. She was about to find out. My name is June, and I am 69 years old, and I have lived in my house on Carmichael Street in Georgia for 27 years. I bought that house alone, with money I saved alone after a divorce that left me with 2 children, a used station wagon, and exactly the kind of determination that only comes from having nothing left to lose. My ex-husband Leonard took most of what we had built together, and I let him, because I was 38 years old and exhausted and I simply wanted it to be over. But I promised myself, standing in the empty apartment I moved into with my kids and a mattress on the floor, that I would build something that was entirely and permanently mine, something with my name on it and nobody else's, something that no person could walk away with when they decided they were done with me. It took me 9 years of teaching high school English, tutoring on weekends, and eating sandwiches for lunch every single day. But in the spring of my 47th year, I bought my house on Carmichael Street, cash purchase, no mortgage deed in my name, and I stood on that front porch the evening of closing and cried in a way I had not cried since my children were born. The kind of crying that is not sadness at all but something that does not have a proper name. Relief and pride and grief and joy all arriving at the same moment. My children grew up in that house. My daughter Patricia, who is now 44 and lives in Oregon with her husband, and my 2 granddaughters, considers it home in the deepest sense of the word, the place she still dreams about, the place she calls when she needs to remember who she is. My son Kevin is 41, an operations manager for a logistics company, and he moved back to Georgia about 6 years ago after living in various cities throughout his 30s. Kevin is a good man. I want to say that clearly and mean it, because this story is not about Kevin being a villain. Kevin is a good man who fell deeply in love with a woman named Amber, and loving Amber made him blind to things he should have seen, the way loving someone powerfully sometimes does, and that blindness cost both of us more than either of us is fully finished paying for. I met Amber about 2 months after Kevin moved back to Georgia. She was 36 at the time, worked in pharmaceutical sales, drove a car that cost more than my first 2 years of savings, and had the kind of groomed, precise attractiveness that signals a person who treats their appearance as a professional asset rather than a personal pleasure. She was polished in a way that I recognized immediately as armor, the way some people build an immaculate surface because the things underneath feel too uncertain to expose. I liked her well enough in the beginning. I made genuine efforts, the kind that cost something, inviting her into my home regularly, learning what she liked to eat, asking real questions about her life and listening to the answers with real attention. She was pleasant in return, cordial, sometimes warm in brief flashes that made me think there was a person underneath the polish who might someday trust me enough to appear. Kevin and Amber married 18 months after they met, a beautiful outdoor wedding that I helped fund significantly, and moved into a rental house nearby. For about a year, things were genuinely fine. Sunday dinners, occasional weeknight visits, the comfortable rhythm of a family that has found its new shape after children grow and return and bring new people with them. And then Amber lost her job. The pharmaceutical company she worked for went through a major restructuring, eliminated her entire regional division, and Amber found herself unexpectedly unemployed for the first time in her adult professional life. She applied for positions immediately, confidently at first, Then, with increasing anxiety as months passed and the right offer did not materialize. Kevin's salary was solid, but their rent was high. Their lifestyle had been built on two incomes, and the financial pressure began showing up in small ways in the tightness around Kevin's eyes when he visited, and Amber's increasingly brief responses when I asked how things were going. About 8 months into Amber's unemployment, Kevin came to me alone one Sunday evening after dinner and asked if they could move in with me temporarily while they stabilized financially. He was embarrassed asking. I could see that clearly, and I loved him for the embarrassment because it meant he still understood what he was asking. I said yes without hesitation, because that is what mothers do, and because I had 4 bedrooms and more space than one person needed, and because I genuinely believed that having them close might give Amber and me the time and proximity to build something more real than the cordial surface we had maintained so far. They moved in on a Saturday in March, and for the first month, everything was manageable. I adjusted my routines to accommodate 2 more people, gave them the largest guest bedroom, cleared space in the bathroom and the kitchen, made myself smaller in my own home the way you do when you love someone and want them to feel comfortable. I told myself this was temporary, 6 months perhaps, a year at most, and that the adjustment was worth it for Kevin's peace of mind and the chance to genuinely know my daughter-in-law better. But Amber had a very particular relationship with spaces she inhabited. She did not adapt to them. She remade them. Within 3 weeks of moving in, my kitchen had been reorganized according to a logic I did not understand and was not consulted about. Within 6 weeks, she had replaced my living room throw pillows with one she preferred and moved my reading chair, the chair I had sat in every evening for 15 years, to a corner of the room where the light was wrong and where it felt, deliberately or not, like something that had been quietly put out of the way. I mentioned the chair once, gently, saying I preferred it near the window for the light when I read in the evenings. Amber said, with a smile that did not reach her eyes, "Oh, I just thought the room flowed better this way, June. But of course it's your house." The last 4 words delivered in a tone that made them sound less like an acknowledgment and more like a concession she found slightly tedious to make. I moved the chair back myself the following morning. It was back in the corner by the time I came home from the grocery store that afternoon. I left it there. Some battles announce clearly that they are not actually about furniture. Kevin noticed none of this. Kevin came home from work, ate the dinners I still cooked most nights because cooking for people I love is one of my genuine pleasures, watched television with Amber in the evenings, and slept the deep, uncomplicated sleep of a man who had convinced himself that because nobody was fighting openly, everything was essentially fine. The situation shifted from uncomfortable to something more serious about 5 months into their stay, when Amber received a strong job offer, a very good position with a competing firm, and turned it down. She told Kevin the salary was not right. She told me, when I asked carefully, that she was being selective, that she did not want to rush into the wrong position. What she did not tell either of us, and what I only learned much later, was that she had begun thinking of my house not as a temporary arrangement but as a permanent solution, and a job would have disrupted the calculations she had quietly started making. I began to understand this when I overheard a phone conversation Amber was having with her friend one afternoon, speaking freely in the way people do when they believe they are alone in a house. I was in the laundry room off the kitchen with the door nearly closed, folding towels, invisible enough that she walked right past without checking. She was saying, "Kevin says she would never kick us out. That is not who she is. And honestly, at this point we have been here long enough that I think we have some rights as residents anyway, especially if I am contributing to the household. I have been looking into it and it is more complicated than people think. You cannot just tell family members to leave after a certain amount of time. There are actually legal protections." Her friend said something I could not hear, and Amber laughed softly and said, "I just think long-term this makes more sense than throwing money at rent. This place will be Kevin's eventually anyway. We are just getting a head start. I stood in that laundry room holding a folded towel, completely still, processing what I had just heard. Amber had been researching tenant rights. She had been calculating residency protections. She believed that time spent in my home was building towards some form of legal claim that would make removal difficult. And she had decided that my character, my unwillingness to hurt my son by forcing a confrontation, was the very tool she intended to use against me. This place will be Kevin's eventually anyway, as though my living was simply an inconvenient delay in an inheritance she had already mentally claimed. I finished folding the towels. I put them away neatly. I went to my room, closed the door, and sat on the edge of my bed thinking about my mother, who used to say that the most dangerous person in any situation is the one everyone has already decided is harmless. I thought about those words for a long time, and then I did something I had not done in years. I pulled out the journal I used to keep when my children were teenagers, the one I wrote in every night to keep my thoughts organized, and I started writing again. Everything, every reorganized cabinet, every moved chair, every calculated smile, every moment I had quietly absorbed over months of trying to make room for a woman who had never once genuinely tried to make room for me. I did not know exactly why I was writing it all down in that moment. I only knew it felt necessary, the way things sometimes feel necessary before you fully understand their purpose. 3 days later, Amber handed me that folded piece of paper across the kitchen counter. It was written in careful, even handwriting, the kind of penmanship that takes deliberate effort to make look casual. It said that she and Kevin had been thinking about my well-being and felt the current living arrangement was not ideal for any of us long-term. It said they had found a lovely senior living community about 20 minutes away with independent units that would give me my own space and people my own age. It said they thought a transition within 30 days would be best for everyone and that they were happy to help me move and get settled. A 30-day notice, written out formally, handed to me in my own kitchen by a woman who had been living in my home on my generosity for nearly 8 months. I looked at that paper for a long moment. I looked at Amber. She was watching me with an expression that was carefully neutral, prepared for tears, prepared for protest, prepared for the quiet crumbling she expected from a harmless old woman who grew tomatoes and read by the window. I folded the paper back exactly the way she had given it to me. I slid it into the pocket of my cardigan. I looked her directly in the eyes, and I smiled. She smiled back, relieved, already certain she had won. I said, "Thank you for writing this down, Amber. I appreciate having things in writing." Then I walked out of the kitchen, picked up my phone, and made the call that changed everything. I called my lawyer. Her name was Caroline Marsh, a sharp and careful woman who had handled my property documentation when I first bought the house and who I had stayed in contact with over the years. I told her I needed an urgent appointment and that I had documentation to bring. She saw me the very next morning. In Caroline's office, I laid out everything methodically, the living arrangement and its timeline, the turned-down job offer, the overheard phone conversation about tenant rights and residency claims, and finally, the written notice Amber had handed me, which I placed on Caroline's desk still folded in thirds exactly as it had been given to me. Caroline listened without interrupting, asked several precise questions, and then told me something that I found both deeply reassuring and quietly illuminating. Georgia law, she explained, was actually very clear on the matter of family members residing in a property owned outright by another family member without any formal lease agreement in place, without a written lease establishing legal tenancy, and without consistent rent payments that could establish a landlord-tenant relationship. Kevin and Amber's legal standing in my property was essentially non-existent regardless of how long they had been residing there. Amber's research into tenant protections had led her to the right general area of law, but the entirely wrong specific conclusion, because those protections applied to tenants, and without a formal rental arrangement, she and Kevin were legally guests in my home, nothing more. But here was the part that made Caroline pause and look at me with something close to admiration. The written notice Amber had handed me, carefully constructed to make my departure look procedurally legitimate and voluntary, had actually accomplished something Amber had not intended at all. It had created a formal paper record of an attempt to remove a property owner from her own home without legal grounds, a document I could now use rather than one that could be used against me. This was the first twist, and I felt something settle in my chest when Caroline explained it, a quiet, solid sensation like standing on ground you have carefully tested and found completely firm beneath your feet. Caroline then asked me something that opened an entirely different dimension of this situation. She asked whether I had made any updates to my estate documents since Kevin moved back to Georgia 6 years earlier. I told her my will was approximately 8 years old, written before Kevin's return, before Amber, before any of this. Caroline nodded slowly and said, "June, I think we need to talk about significantly more than just your current living situation. I think we need to talk about your entire estate structure, because what you have described suggests that certain assumptions are being made about your property that your existing documents do not adequately address or protect against." I went home that evening and called Patricia in Oregon. My daughter, who had always been the more perceptive of my two children, listened to everything without interrupting, and when I finished she said very quietly, "Mom, how long has this actually been building?" I told her honestly, longer than I had allowed myself to admit. Patricia said simply, "What do you need from me?" I told her I needed her to trust me completely, that I had a plan taking shape, and that I needed approximately 60 days to put it fully in place before anything became visible to Kevin or Amber. Patricia, who has always understood that her mother's silences are never empty, said, "Okay, Mom, I trust you. Call me every single week." Over the following 8 weeks, Caroline and I rebuilt everything from the ground up. My will, which had left the house and my carefully managed savings equally between Kevin and Patricia, was rewritten with significant and entirely deliberate changes. The house was placed in a living trust with myself as sole trustee and lifetime beneficiary, with successor provisions that removed every ambiguity about control of the property during my lifetime and established clear, legally airtight terms for what happened after. The distribution structure was adjusted to reflect something I had been quietly thinking about long before Amber handed me that paper, something that my conversations with Caroline had finally crystallized into a decision I felt entirely at peace with. Patricia's share remained completely unchanged because Patricia had never once treated my home or my assets as something she was entitled to before I was finished with them. Kevin's share was restructured, not eliminated, because Kevin was my son and I believed his blindness to Amber's behavior was genuine rather than calculated, but restructured specifically so that the house itself was removed from any direct inheritance and replaced with a cash equivalent drawn from other assets, precisely so that my home could never become the subject of a marital property dispute regardless of what happened between Kevin and Amber in the future. And then there was the additional provision, the one I think of as the quiet heart of everything I built during those 8 weeks. I established a specific clause stating that any person who had made documented attempts to remove me from my primary residence without legal grounds, or who had researched or pursued residency claims against my property without my knowledge or consent, would be considered to have acted in bad faith against the trust and would be entirely excluded from any beneficial interest in the trust's assets. Caroline documented everything with meticulous precision. Amber's written notice, my detailed account of the overheard phone conversation, dated and time-stamped to the best of my recollection, the full timeline of the residency arrangement, every piece of it legally sound, properly preserved, permanently on record. Then I went home, made dinner, watered my tomatoes, and waited. The second twist arrived about 3 weeks into my preparation period in a form I genuinely had not anticipated. Kevin came downstairs early one morning while Amber was still sleeping, sat across from me at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee he barely touched, and looked at me with the expression I recognized from his childhood as the face he made when he was carrying something he did not know how to put down. "Mom," he said, "I need to ask you something directly." I told him to go ahead. "Did Amber give you some kind of notice about the house, about moving?" I looked at my son carefully. "Why are you asking me that, Kevin?" He put both hands around his coffee cup without drinking from it. "Because I found something on her laptop about a week ago. I was not looking for it. I needed to print a work document and it was open on the screen. It looked like a draft of a letter, something about a transition timeline, something about a senior community. I closed it immediately, but Mom, I have been thinking about it every single day since and I cannot keep pretending I did not see it." I reached into the pocket of my cardigan and placed the folded paper on the table between us. Kevin picked it up. He read it slowly. He read it a second time. He set it down and did not say anything for so long that the coffee in both our cups went cold. When he finally looked up, his eyes were wet, not quite crying but close enough that the distinction barely mattered. "Mom, I did not know she was going to do this. I want you to know that I did not know." "I believe you," I said, "and I did. Why didn't you tell me the moment she gave it to you?" I looked at my son across the kitchen table and told him the most honest thing I had said out loud in months. "Because I needed to see what kind of man you were when you found out on your own, without me putting it in front of you." He'd absorbed that quietly. Then he asked, "What are you going to do?" And I told him the truth. I have already done it. The third twist, the one that shifted the entire landscape of everything still to come, arrived approximately 2 weeks before I had planned the final family conversation, from a direction that none of us had anticipated. Amber's former employer reached out with an unexpected offer: a restructured division, a new role, a strong compensation package, based in their Atlanta office. The offer arrived on a Friday. By Sunday, something in the atmosphere of the house had changed in a way I could feel before I could explain it. Amber was quieter, more watchful, glancing at me with an expression I could not immediately name. On Monday morning, Kevin came downstairs before Amber was awake and told me carefully that the job offer had changed their financial picture significantly, that he and Amber had been talking, and that they thought it was probably time to start looking for their own place again. He said it gently, framing it as a mutual decision, a practical response to new circumstances. I understood exactly what had actually happened. Amber was perceptive enough to have noticed something different in my stillness over the preceding weeks, some quality of watchfulness that she could not identify but could feel. She had recalculated. The job offer had restored the financial argument for independence, and something in my changed manner had introduced a quiet uncertainty she was not comfortable enough to investigate directly. She had decided to reposition the retreat as a choice rather than wait for it to become a consequence. I told Kevin that sounded like a very healthy plan, that I was genuinely glad the offer had come through, and that they were welcome to take reasonable time finding the right place. I meant every word of it. They moved out 7 weeks later on a gray Saturday morning. The day was quiet, mostly peaceful, carrying the particular emotional weight of things that have cost everyone something and that nobody wants to fully name out loud. When the last box was loaded and Kevin hugged me goodbye on the front porch, he held on slightly longer than usual. He said quietly into my shoulder, "I am sorry, Mom, for not seeing things clearly, for letting things get as far as they got." I held my son and said the truest thing available. "You see them clearly now. That is what matters most." After they drove away, I went back inside my house, moved my reading chair back to its place beside the window, sat down in the afternoon light that fell exactly the way I had always loved it, and called Caroline to tell her the house was entirely my own again. Then I called Patricia, who answered on the first ring the way she always does when she knows something important is resolved, and I told her it was done. She cried a little, the way Patricia does when relief finally arrives after long tension, and then she laughed, and then she said, "Mom, only you could handle something this serious so quietly that the people involved never fully understood what happened until it was already over." I told her that was precisely the point. It has been 4 months since Kevin and Amber moved out. Kevin comes for Sunday dinner most weeks, sometimes with Amber, sometimes alone, and the dynamic between us carries the particular quality of people who have been through something genuinely difficult and come out the other side with considerably more honesty than they started with. Amber is cordial with me now in a way that feels different from before, less performed, more careful, the manner of someone who has quietly revised their understanding of a situation and is not entirely sure how much the other person knows. She has never mentioned the paper she handed me. I have never mentioned it either. Some understandings communicate more completely through shared silence than they ever could through direct conversation. My house on Carmichael Street is exactly as it was the evening I stood on this porch 27 years ago after closing, crying the kind of tears that have no proper name. My reading chair is by the window where it belongs. My kitchen cabinets are organized exactly the way I have always organized them. My tomatoes are growing in the backyard. My front porch in the evening is as peaceful as it was before anyone decided it belonged to them. And my state documents are updated, thorough, legally airtight, and entirely reflective of the life I have actually lived and the values I have genuinely held, rather than the assumptions other people made about what I would quietly hand over without ever fighting back. If I could say one thing to every quiet woman who has ever been underestimated, who has ever been handed a piece of paper in her own kitchen by someone who mistook her gentleness for weakness, who has ever smiled when she wanted to scream because she already knew something the other person did not, it would be this. So, take the paper, fold it carefully, put it in your pocket, and then call your lawyer. Because the quietest women always know exactly what they own. They are simply waiting, with complete patience and absolute certainty, for the right moment to remind everyone else. I'm 69 years old. I have lived in my house for 27 years. My name is on the deed, on the trust, and on every document that has ever mattered. And I am not going anywhere.